Okay, so we're back here, our second segment, taking some of the core concepts around antifragility and kind of playing with them in the context of real scenarios with athletes, coaches, parents of athletes, you name it, but really kind of anything in that sports and competitive realm. So this week, the topic is sort of the second framework that we've argued for, put out there, which is the idea that if you want to help yourself or your student athlete or one of your players with anything in the realm of well-being, resilience, or performance, and we've kind of argued that's what makes up antifragility, well-being, resilience, and performance, then you've got to kind of tackle each and every one of those from the standpoint of three lenses, right? Top down, bottom up, outside in. We'll give a one sentence sort of description, but if you want to get a deeper dive, go back into sort of the main podcast channel and check out our conversation around this. For now, it's pretty simple. Top down, thinking about your thinking. This is confidence, this is efficacy, this is gratitude, this is mindset, this is growth mindset. You name it, it's top down, thinking about your thinking. Bottom up, really kind of body first, if you will, or as Adam said a few times, 100% nervous system. It's focusing in on things like sleep, nutrition, hydration, temperature exposure, breath work, etc. And then last, certainly not least, outside in, which is social or environmental. Pay attention to who you surround yourself with, how they impact you or your student athletes' mindsets, moods, motivations, habits, sense of purpose, etc. Right? So last time we opened up with, I think, a pretty common scenario a lot of parents and athletes and coaches are dealing with, which is just guiding the athlete themselves, or if you are the athlete yourself, through the college recruiting process, or maybe just any process. Maybe it's a draft process. We've had athletes, right, go through that kind of prospective process. And so let's tackle that sort of scenario from these three lenses: top down, bottom up, outside in. One of the three you feel particularly compelled to start with?
I mean, I always think it's easier to start with the biological, just to check the boxes on that.
Yeah, go for it. So you're dealing with an athlete who, I mean, maybe in your case they just got called up. We talked last week, right? You have a child of your own going through this process. I've done this a lot. What are some of the things you look at and help an athlete to think about first when it comes to the bio side?
I mean, this is going to seem really simplistic, but the first thing to think about is, what are you actually feeling day to day? And on the one hand, it helps to have something like some kind of HRV monitoring device where we have an understanding what how you're recovering, but also it's having that ongoing conversation in terms of, what is your energy like? What is your mood like? What is your stress level like? Often these are questions that athletes have never had to put real words to. In other words, it was implicitly assumed, but it was never explicitly expressed.
Yeah.
So teaching people how to talk about this in a way that's measurable and that we could concretize and we can activate on is essential. And it's a good place to start.
You start with a scoreboard, essentially, right? Like having a sense of how I'm feeling, right? Whether it's up, down, outside, like all those sorts of things. But then I like the piece you hit there. You got to have a lexicon, and we can get into it a little bit more if we talk about emotional intelligence. But this is something I'll hammer home a lot. And for our listeners, just like if we were sitting in front of a group and I asked you and everyone in that group to write a list, right, of every emotion you could think of, the group average would be somewhere in the single digits. Right? And there's arguably 100, if not more, sort of different types of emotions. And the reason I say that is we have a poor emotional vocabulary. And I think part of the point you're making is we often have a very weak somatic vocabulary as well. Where would people get started?
I think there are assessments to use, but sometimes I make this so simplistic it's going to sound sophomoric, but the idea is I basically use red light, yellow light, green light, and this is what professional athletes. Sometimes when we overthink things and over-intellectualize, it gets in the way of basic feeling. So I would just ask them, how are you coming in today? You red, yellow, green? Something that simple. If it's green, we go with the flow. If it's yellow, we consider for a moment of what we might have in place, right? Given that they may not be optimized, in terms of get them to a higher level if we can, accepting where they are with the idea that we're going to try the best we can to dial in and get you maybe a notch up. If we're red, we're probably going to sit down and reconsider what that training looks like for that day and maybe not go as intensely. We're probably going to adapt and actually change our plans for the day.
Yeah, that's good. One of our board members, Donnie Taylor, who's a world champion athlete, and she was just recently on Flourish FM, right, to talk about this. She uses that system, which she learned from her performance coach as well. I've seen that in other environments. I really like that. I think that's a pretty simple, solid heuristic, right? So then let's move to which one do you want to go to next, top down or outside in?
Let's go top down.
All right. So top down, right? We've got this athlete. I think first and foremost, like what comes up to me, and we talked about this a little bit in the first segment, is what is the athlete's and the parents and the coaches' mindset and attitude going into this process as a whole. What is it for? What is it about? And then based on that, what does that sort of dictate the types of thoughts and perspectives and subsequent behaviors that we should have? In agreement there, or do you think there's a different starting point?
I think it's a great starting point because this process is so filled up with ambiguity and expectations that, you need to understand both the athlete and the parents' schema and how they're approaching this. Because sometimes we will project our own ideas, and often that doesn't line up with where they're coming from.
Yeah. From there, I think this is where it gets tricky because there's so many different tools, I think, in all of these buckets, top down, bottom up, outside in. So we're going to get into these, I think, individually, bit by bit, over the course of our conversations. But let's just start with, you always use this phrase really, really well, kind of minimum viable dose. I like saying where the juice is worth the squeeze. But like, what's our top 2 or 3 list, kind of top down things to get started with? I'll give you one. I think you probably go to, it's obvious, but mindfulness, right? You referenced earlier, like the ability to catch the moment and be aware of thoughts, feelings, whatever it might be. It underpins everything else, and I'd argue a lot of that is happening top down. So that's certainly one for me. How about 1 or 2 more from you?
Yeah. I think also we would say, what are we looking to achieve here, right? Beyond psychological flexibility and growth mindset, like we want to be proactive. We want to be strategic. We want to underline things like patience and persistence in this process, which can really grind you down because you lack agency, right? And it's filled with so much open-endedness and ambiguity. It can be very stressful. So I do think part of this too is getting better at witnessing what you're feeling and what you're thinking, and learning to label and accept it. And then going back to this idea, always when I sit down with an athlete, it's like, well, what are our values? Not only in baseball, not only or any sport that you're playing, but just in general. And okay, well, how they align with how you're acting in relation to those thoughts and feelings that you're experiencing right now.
Yeah.
And we do this without judgment, and that's the mindfulness part, like without judgment. It's all under this framework of mindfulness because mindlessness can get us in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. So awareness of self, awareness of values. I also heard, kind of parts, what we call cognitive behavioral technique or acceptance commitment technique. We can put some resources in the description, but we've also got plenty of resources available on those topics on our website, totally free, no email required. You can just go download it, piece of cake, the antifragileacademy.com. Cool. Anything else then you would add, kind of cherry on top before we moved outside in?
I think there's a big one here, and that is the idea for an athlete to be proactive and strategic in a situation when largely they don't feel like they have a lot of power. And one way that we go about doing this is called, this reframing idea, where we're taking what would otherwise be a threatening experience and switching it and turning it upside down to make it a challenge. So what do I mean by that? It's like, rather than waiting for coaches to reach out to you, try to get athletes to be proactive, right? And not waiting for the opportunity to come, knocking on the door, to get out of their comfort zone, reaching out to coaches, even though it feels uncomfortable, but initiating contact in a way that could create opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be there. Even though it doesn't feel right, it's value aligned. And part of what we see when we shift threat to challenge, we see physiological changes. It's not just a psychological change. We see physiological changes that can allow us to move forward, right, to what was otherwise a threat, with the idea that we can now be offensive and work to conquer it.
Yeah, good. Okay, last, again, certainly not least, outside in. So common examples here that I think come up for me, again, is there alignment in messaging, communication, and priorities between all parties involved in this process? So that is typically going to be the student athlete themselves or the amateur, collegiate, maybe even professional athlete. Their, let's call it representation, which is in the case of student athletes is going to be family, right, parent or guardians. In other cases, it might be agent, right, you name it. And then certainly the coach involved. Right? If those parties are not in alignment and on the same page, I think the student athlete is set up for an immeasurably increased amount of stress, pressure, ambiguity, kind of conflict. And it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to be in perfect agreement in terms of what to do or how to do it. But there should be, I think, some consistency and agreement about what it is you are attempting to do, what that means for the moments of adversity, what that means for hopefully moments of celebration, right? Outside of that, I think, again, it's always important to key into who the student athlete, whether it's you yourself, right, or your child or your player, is spending time around, right? What are their habits? What are their motivations, right? What sort of messaging are they sending about what is a quote unquote good or bad school, good or bad program, right? What's right or wrong for that student? And we're not talking about siloing and isolating, so we're just trying to snowplow or protect the athlete from those experiences. We're just talking about, I think, setting them up to be thoughtful and aware and strategic about how they go about interacting with other people, teammates, competitors, whatever it might be, and making sure, again, going back to top down, they stay values aligned, right? They kind of understand and like stay the course, even when it's unpleasant, right? Those are a couple things that come up for me. Anything else for you from the outside in perspective?
I guess I'm just thinking in terms of being aware of a cultural, academic, and performance fit, and having expectations aligned, and also it's internalizing these ideas, these social social influence matters. Michael Gervais just wrote that book, In Fear of Other People's Opinions, and I think what we don't even realize it in terms of how we internalize these ideas as internalized objects, and it becomes our lens in which we see the world. I was talking to an athlete the other day who was accepted to a D1 school with scholarship, very good D1 school, I would say a top 30 D1 liberal arts school, but he was embarrassed to put that on his Instagram because he thought it wasn't necessarily academic enough within the culture he existed, even though it might be a perfect fit for him.
Perfect fit, yeah. That's a really good example where this can cut kind of either way, depending on the surroundings, the community, the messaging, even values, virtues, strengths. Like we say this all the time, they're contextual, right? Like I mean, we're sitting here in the States, I think as Americans and as people who were athletes and appreciate sports and athletics, like you better be damn happy if you're like physically gifted that you happen to be born into a place that like values that in certain ways, shapes, or forms, because it's not always the case, right? Even these things are contextual.
Sure.
So, cool. Great. Okay, so another good conversation here, kind of continuing on this path. Quick summary, talking about the pressures and sort of the process of, let's say, the collegiate recruiting experience, or just sort of transitioning into the next stage, next level, whatever it might be. When it comes to anti-fragility, which we break down as well-being, right? Build the good, resilience, recover from and learn from the bad, performance, optimize towards meaningful things, right? Behave well, perform well. We recommend kind of a 3-part lens. Top down, think about your thinking, mindset, attitude, self-talk, perspective taking. Bottom up, dial in your body, sleep, nutrition, hydration, temperature exposure, breath work, etc. Exercise, kind of obvious maybe for athletes. And then outside in, paying attention to relationships, community, habits, moods, behaviors that we are potentially picking up from the people around us, right? That's it for this week. We'll be back more next week with another scenario and another topic.